Okay, welcome back. Today we're going to speak about and look at and practice floor plans and elevations, which are some of the most common drawings that you will be creating and reading in this industry. So if we think back to orthographic projection, floor plans are the same as your top view. So it is the object, or in this case, the building, shown from above. There are lots of different types of plans out there. Today we're going to focus, like I said, on floor plans, which just show us the entire building itself. But you can also have detailed plans, which may zoom in on a particular room or a particular area, and they'll just kind of be a large-scaled version of a floor plan. You'll see those sometimes with different kitchen areas to kind of help show what the layout of the kitchen is. You can also have what's called a site plan, which would just show the entire site. It shows all the property lines and where the building itself is located on the property, as well as any landscaping features. We'll spend a day reviewing site plans. And you can also have construction style plans, so ones that may show the roof plan or the rafter layout, and foundation plans. All of these are still taken from that same view perspective of a view from above, but they kind of show different things. We'll spend a whole day doing foundation plans as well. So today we're just focusing on just the entire layout of a building or a floor plan. And so the floor plan is, in a way, it's a section view taken at a height that can show the placement of the walls, windows, doors, cabinets, and any other important features. So next class we'll go over sections and how they're typically used in a set of plans. But a section view is it's kind of cutting your building open. And so this would be a horizontal cut where we're taking like the roof off of the building, and this way we can see any interior walls, we can see the placement of all the windows, we can see the placement of all the doors. It shows our building divided into different rooms, and there will be a floor plan for every floor of the building. So in the practices we're going to do in class, especially just for our hand drawing practices, and for our AutoCAD as well, we're only going to do a one-story building. But if I had a building with multiple floors, there would be a different floor plan for each and every one of them. So, as I mentioned before, the floor plan is showing all of the walls, doors, and windows. And it shows how the building is divided into rooms and how I would get from one room to another. And it's important before you really start construction or really looking into the nitty-gritty of the building, laying out any dimensions in your plans, you really want to think about that, how are you getting from one room to another one. And so we refer to those as traffic patterns of how, when I walk into the front door, how do I get into kind of just the main areas? How do I get into like the family den or the family room? How do I get to the kitchen? Is there easy access into the kitchen from the garage? So when I'm bringing in groceries, you want to think about in the layout before you start creating it. And then as the person who is in charge of making the building, you want to kind of just familiarize yourself with that layout before you start measuring anything or putting anything down. Within the dimensions on a plan, you are seeing all of the different sizes and locations of the walls, partitions, doors, windows, and any other important features. On frame construction or wood framing, exterior walls are usually dimensioned to the outside face of the frame. If your walls are to be covered with a stucco or brick veneer or wood siding, those materials are sitting outside of your dimensioned face. Interior walls can be dimensioned to either face of the stud or even to the center of the stud, which is what I typically do. And then any openings, like doors or windows, are dimensioned to the center of the opening. And so the reason why we measure our exterior walls to the face of the stud is because when I'm laying out that building and I'm measuring everything, the most cutting I'm going to do to kind of lay out that building is going to be to that dimensional lumber to frame it out. And so I want those numbers to be easy, comfortable numbers. And then once I put sheathing on the outside and, my air gap and then my masonry veneer, that's just kind of going to be extra. And I'm not really in charge of those measurements as much. The siding is as thick as the siding is. I don't have any really say on how thick it may be. And so if you were to go up to a building and with a tape measure after construction's completed, and if the plans say that the building, that wall is 24 feet long, from absolute outside to absolute outside of the building is going to actually be a little bit longer than 24 feet. That 24 is measuring from the face of the stud to the face of the stud, or outside of that frame, not necessarily the outside of the building. That just tends to be a concept, especially when we get on the computer, that a lot of students forget, and so I'm going to be mentioning it a lot, over and over and over again. Now, if I was creating a building that's being made out of CMUs or just masonry construction, I would then place my dimensions to the faces and edges of the walls as well as openings. And so for an example of that, on the top, this would be with wood framing or construction, and this would be how I would dimension for masonry framing. So with wood, we can see that we're going from the outside to the center of the opening, to the center of the opening, and then outside to the center of the opening. And the same thing with the walls. In this case, they went from outside of the wall to the outside of this wall. And in this particular instance, if I was creating this drawing, I would also measure to the outside of this wall, purely because this interior wall, this interior partition, shares that edge with this exterior wall. But I'll often, if I'm doing interior partitions, I'll often dimension to the center of those studs as well. And then in masonry framing, rather going to the center of this window, we're going from the outside of the wall to the edge of the window, to the edge of the window, to the edge, over and over and over again. And so that's just kind of a difference between the two of them. All of the practices we'll be doing in class, we're going to be focusing on wood frame construction, which would then be to the center of those openings. So if I'm laying out my floor plan in a series of steps, the first thing I would do would to be establish an overall grid for the exterior walls. So I would lay out how long I would want each one of these walls to be just from that outside of the frame, and I would establish a grid to kind of just go and put that together. Next, I would start to include my walls and any openings in those walls, any columns and posts that may be included in the building. So walls are not going to exist as just a 2D line in your drawing. So we can see in the dimensioning practice or the dimensioning examples, there's an outside of the wall and there's an inside. Because it's made up of materials and those materials have thickness, we need to signify how thick those materials are in our drawings that we create. And so we will have that outside and inside. And depending on what scale we're drawing on, we may include a hatch pattern for it, or we may just make it a solid hatch. The other thing you'll notice in this example, and you'll notice in the practice that I'll do in a couple of minutes, is that wherever our walls meet, we have it as kind of a just clean corner. We don't have little lines overlapping. We may have those in there when we're laying out guidelines, but we wouldn't put them in the final finished product. After you lay out all of your walls and openings, that's when you would start to put in all of your different built-in elements. So you would start to include the architectural symbols for your different window types and for your doors. You'd put in symbols for cabinetry, for toilets, sinks, built-in elements like stairs or fireplaces. And in this step, the textbook example that this picture, so this is just a picture from your textbook if you didn't do the reading. If you did the reading, it may look familiar. But they also included the extension lines and dimension lines for these different elements. Personally, I wouldn't do them right now. I would wait until I had all of my symbols and then put them in. But I can understand where this, or whoever made this drawing, is coming from, in that, well, they had to measure to the center of that window anyway, so they might as well just put in the extension line. So I understand it, but I personally would at least wait until I had all of the elements in there, and that's then when I would start to include the extension lines and the dimensions themselves, as well as start to put in different references for the other drawings I'm going to create. So this is where I may put elevation markers, or in this case, they've put lots of different section markers. They've put the different reference symbols for the windows and the door tags. They've put in more building sections and just markers. You'll notice that there are no tags or references like inside these. So there's no view number and sheet number included on here. There's this symbol that says that is tagging this door, but there's no number included, and that's just because the schedule hasn't been made yet, or this view hasn't been drawn yet. So we don't know what view number it is or what page it's going to be on, but the symbol's there as a reminder that that view needs to be drawn, and then once it's drawn, that information can get updated. And so any different notes and leaders would get added in. This is when you can start to populate your different reference symbols with information about what type of door that is, what window that is in the schedule, and such. And then you can start to add in all of your other notes. We are not going to make something as complicated as this. And this also does look a lot more complicated, purely just because it's shrunken down for the screen. But our practices are going to be a little bit more simplistic, since this is the introduction class to architectural drawing. So what we'll do now is kind of a practice of making a building. There is no drawing to go along with it yet. That's what we're going to make. And we just have kind of a set of instructions written out. And so this also will hopefully kind of show this is why we use drawings rather than just written sets of instructions to create buildings. There may be some information missing on this slide right here. If there is, I'll make sure to update it before I upload the PDF copy of this presentation. But I went through it. I'm pretty sure I didn't leave anything out, but we'll see. So we're going to make a 10 by 10 building, wall thickness of 6 inches. We're going to have 3 openings in this building that are all 3 feet wide. A door on the east wall that's 4 feet in from the south. A window on the west wall that is in line with the door that is opposite from it, and then another window centered on the north wall. For our practice, we'll say that north is on the top of the page, and we're going to draw this with a scale of 1/2 inch equals a foot, which is larger than what most drawings are done at. Most drawings are typically done at 1/4 inch equals a foot, but I felt for a first practice it might be better to do it a little larger, because drawing larger is a little bit more forgiving and you can erase a little bit easier, and we can maybe see some details a little bit more. So what I would recommend is to watch me go through this kind of step by step without following along, and then you can go back you can just go back to the beginning of this part and then follow along with it. But ultimately, if you did want to follow along the whole time, I guess that's okay. I can't stop you. So I have here some tracing paper, and what I'm going to be using, like within my previous demos, is I'm going to use my T-square to do my horizontal lines. I'm going to use my set square to do my vertical lines. If you don't have a T-square and triangle, that's okay, because what you can do is you can just tape a piece of graph paper down, and you could use that as your reference to help keep all of your lines nice and straight. I would also recommend that after you tape your graph paper down, you kind of line up the edge of your tracing paper on top of it. That way just your tracing paper isn't all weird and wonky sitting on top of there. At least they're both taped nice and straight. But since I have a T-square, I'm just going to line up my T-square with the edge of my paper, find my tape, and tape it down. And so the other tools you're going to need are some type of straight edge. So in my case, it's this ruler, which I'm not really going to use because I have my T-square and my triangle to act as straight edges. But you'll need some type of straight edge if you don't have a T-square and triangle. You'll need your architect scale. You'll need some tape, of course. You'll need a pencil, of course. All right, so now I have my page taped down, and that way I could just make sure my paper stays stationary, and I can either use my grid to help me lay out my lines or use my tools to help me lay out all my lines. And when I taped my graph paper down, I just lined it up with my straight edge. If you do have like a T-square and a triangle, then you really don't need the graph paper underneath. But I just wanted to put it there for those who maybe are using just graph paper, because we're using whatever we got handy at the moment. All right, and let me zoom in a little bit on it too. Oh, that it. And I'll just, you know what? Let's see. How zoomed can I get? Because I want to be as close as possible, just so I can show you this kind of as detailed as possible. Okay. So we're going to be drawing this with at a 1/2 inch equals a foot, and the north side is facing upward, which means that this will be my south wall will be down here, my north wall will be here, this will be my west, this will be my east. That's just kind of just a little bit of reference. I'm going to erase these actually because I just don't want them there for now. I may add them back in later just as I talk my way through this. But our first thing is we got to pick somewhere to start for our floor plan. And so just like with an orthographic, I'm just going to draw a guideline out. And remember, your guidelines should always be very, very light, so that way they're easy to erase. And so what I always recommend is kind of like holding the pencil up at the top of it, so that way you're not pressing down too hard. I draw my guidelines kind of dark just to make sure they show up on camera. You might even want to go lighter than that. I do know that these are going to erase easily just because I was applying very little pressure, and I'm using a B pencil, and that's why they came out a little darker. So that's just going to kind of be my starting point for my overall outside of my walls. And then I'm going to measure my walls to be 10 feet. So we're using a 1/2 inch equals a foot scale. So I'm going to spin my architect scale around until I find the 1/2 inch equals a foot. I'm seeing that that 0 number is a little bit higher up. So compared to the other scale running from left to right, this 0 is lower down, which means these ones are referring to the 1 foot or 1 inch equals a foot. These numbers are referring to the 1/2 inch equals a foot. And so I'm going to measure out 10 feet, and I'm just going to make a little notation at 10 feet. So keep in mind too, you want to go to that 0 mark. These are representing inches. So this actually, if I measured from 10 foot to here, that would be 11 feet, and that would be a bad thing. And then again, I'll line up my 0, and I'm going to measure to 10 feet. And now, if I didn't have tools like I have here, what I could do is measure out my 5 inches on another graph line, measure out my 5 inches or my 10 feet, and then I can just connect the dots. But since I have these tools, I'm going to use them. And so I've just laid out a general box or a general grid for my 10 foot by 10 foot building and for my guidelines. Next is I'll add in my wall thickness. So on each side, I'm going to measure 1/2 of these tick marks in, or 6 inches in, on all of my walls. So I'm just going to move my scale around until I've measured 6 inches in on all of them. This is too why I recommended a 1/4 inch graph paper, because then in this case, if your graph is at a 1/4 of an inch, then you can just do 2 graph boxes, but my graph paper actually isn't a 1/4 an inch, so. And I'm just going to line up. And so I have my overall building layout, and I always measure 6 inches in because it's 10 feet from outside to outside. So I measured 6 inches in on all sides, and I have my overall layout of my building. Whoops, I erased a little bit more than I wanted to. It's okay. I can fix it. This also too is a really nice tool to have as a little drafting brush, because your hand is going to smudge everything. And if you've been working on a hand drawing for a very long time, like you've sunk hours into that thing, and then you just smudge it, you get really upset and you say lots of expletives. So I like having a brush rather than my hands. And so I have now my overall layout. And what I had mentioned before is that whenever we have corners meet in our plans, we tend to we don't like having them with these little crisscrosses. And that's where a tool like this erasing shield can come in handy, where I can then kind of just go in and erase in little areas without erasing the parts that I want to keep. I've found also that just using a regular eraser and just being a little careful at a scale like this is okay. So just you can get close to your edges and just don't get too crazy with your eraser. In some instances, if I know I'm going to put a solid hatch in there, I'm just going to fill it with just pencil or color, which it's called like a poche or a pouche. It's like some French word. I call it poche. Hopefully I haven't been pronouncing it wrong my whole life. But if I am going to fill this in with a solid, then I don't need to worry about cleaning the corners up because I'm just going to color it in anyway. So what's the point? But in this case, I'm actually just going to leave the walls as just kind of an empty without a fill. So I'm going to clean the corners up. So now I have the overall layout of the walls and the wall thickness. I'm not going to darken any of my guidelines still because I need to put my windows and my doors in, and I don't want to darken anywhere that may be actually going to be used as a window or a door. So I'm first going to measure out where they would go, and then I'll darken in on the very last step. So our door is going to be on the east wall. So this is the east, the west, the north, the south. We're going to put our door on the east wall, 4 feet from the south wall. So I'm going to measure 4 feet from the face of, or from the outside of that south wall, 4 feet up. And that's where the center of my door is going to be, because doors and openings are measured to the center. So with my 1/2 inch scale, I'll line up my 0, and I'm going to measure to 4 feet and just make a little mark. So I'm still never going to actually use this to draw any line work. And that's now going to be for the center of my door. Next is to lay out the door width itself. And so in this case, we have a 3 foot wide door. And there's a couple of different ways I could do this, but the way I like to do it is to measure out from 1.5 feet in each direction if I'm using the 1/4 inch scale. So in this scenario, what I'm going to do is, rather than line up like my 0 here and then just try to measure out, I'm going to line it up with 6 inches. Since I'm going to have to go 1.5 feet on each side, I'm lining my 6 inch up with my center. So that's giving me 6 inches. And then I'm just going to measure to 1 feet or 1 foot. Then in the other direction, I'm actually going to line the center up with 1 foot and measure to 6 inches. And so then I have my 3 foot wide opening centered around 4 foot. Then I can just draw guides through all of them. You probably are asking, hey Dinah, why'd you go so far with those? And that's just because I'm actually going to bring them even further out, so that way I can use them as references for that window, because there's a window on the west wall that's in line with that door. And so now I don't have to measure over here on that west side. If you don't have your T-square, what you can do for those measurements is you measure it on this side of the wall, and then you can come over to the other side and take your measurement of first 4 feet, and then you can just kind of connect the dots for them. But so now this is going to be the opening for my door. So I can erase this part of the wall. And I'll erase some of this guide work too. I'm going to keep some of it just to use for dimensions. Now, with doors, I didn't say in the instructions what type of door it is, so we're just going to say it's like a typical regular swing door. You want to think about, when you're placing them, which way they're going to be opening into the room. So it's often that we place doors kind of more towards the corner of the room, and if we have it swing open, we're going to want the door to swing open this way. So that way when the door's open, it's only blocking this area rather than blocking this larger area here. And we always want to have them swing into the room. Since this is only one singular room, I don't want the door hinge to swing out this way. I'm just going to have it swing in there. So my door is going to be 3 feet in length. And so I'm going to measure out 3 feet. And typically we'll show them as like 1.5 inches or 2 inches thick. So I'll take my scale. I'm going to measure to just about, we'll make it 2 inches, why not? Now the other thing that never really concerns me when I'm doing layout lines in like a hand drawing is this drawing right here is usually never my final product, my last version. I usually then, once I lay everything out one time, then I'll put another sheet of tracing paper over it, and then I'll do all of my finalized line work. So you'll see that in the demo I do next week, where I'll leave just a lot of dirty guidelines on here just because this is never going to be my final product. But here's my door. And then there's kind of 2 schools of thought of how you can show a door swing on a building. It's a real hotly debated topic. So regardless of that, we've got our door. Look how beautiful my doors are. I shouldn't have put them so close to each other. Here, I'll put the other one down here. So you can have it where it shows the arc of the swing in either way. So you can have it as just like a 45-degree line, or you can have it as a curved line. If I'm doing a drawing with a computer, I do a curved line. If I'm doing a hand drawing, I do it as that straight tick or that 45 line, purely because that's way easier to draw. So I'm just going to take a straight edge and just, oops, it might help if I actually have it lined up, and just kind of connect the dots. And this too can be where I maybe start, for this one, this will be just my finished drawing. I'm not going to trace this at all. But this is where I can start kind of darkening in what's guide work and what's actual building. If I ever do a hand drawing, like a very specific hand drawing like this one, where everything's dimensioned and put together and not just like a freehand sketch, I usually do leave guide work there just because I think it adds a little bit more character to the drawing. But it can also be erased. So I've got my door. I already have the edges of my windows laid out because I was just able to bring those guides over. And once again, for a hand drawing, what I'll usually do is in the floor plan, I'll just signify the window with just a line right down the middle. So I'm just going to make a little mark at 3 inches, and then I can measure on this one a little mark at 3 inches. And I'll just draw a line through it. And then views like the elevation, which we'll talk about in a moment, is where I can kind of understand a bit more about what type of window that is. So windows, we do keep the edges on both sides though. So I would keep these lines here as solid lines for my window. It's only with doors would I erase that opening. And then I also have one last window on the north wall centered. So this is my north wall. My wall is 10 feet wide. So I'll spin my scale around, and I'm just going to measure to 5 feet, which in this case is right here. Even though it says the number 8 on it, you got to remember that this is technically 1 foot, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, so on, so on. So I've got my center of my window, and then I'm going to measure 1.5 feet in one direction. So I'm lining it up with the 6 inches and measuring to 1 foot. And then I'm lining my center point up with a foot and measuring to 6 inches. And I'll just bring some guides down. And then I could measure 3 inches. What I tend to do myself is just kind of eyeball to the center. And eventually you can get pretty good at eyeballing it. That light's kind of reflecting the pencil a little weird, but then I can go over and heavily draw in my line work for what is my walls and my windows. So once I have everything laid out like I had on here, that's typically when I would take a new sheet of tracing paper and I would trace over it. Since this is just a little practice for class and also not that complicated of a building, I'm not going to redo the whole thing. I'm just going to kind of leave it as is. And I can then use these guidelines also for measurements or for my dimensions and my extension lines. So one thing to consider with your extension lines and dimensions is a concept about line weight. And so line weight is just how thick your lines are or how heavy they are. And we generally want to keep our walls as the heaviest lines on our entire page. Then our windows and doors and other kind of built-ins come secondary. And then our dimensions and our extension lines are even lighter than that. So how we can control that is with different types of pencils. So if you have, as I'm pretty sure I mentioned on that very first, like in the course introduction, but if not, you'll have to forgive me, because sometimes, since I just say the same thing over and over and over again, I forget who I've told things to and who I haven't, and I don't have you guys to tell me. You told us that already, shut up. But you've got those different types of pencils, so how this is a 7H versus just like a 4H or a 3H. So depending on that number is how hard it is, and like this is another B pencil. And so that's where I can use those variety of different types of drawing pencils. If I use a 4H, it's going to come out lighter than if I use a 2H, versus then if I use a B pencil, it'll come out blacker. And so I can vary with that. Or if all I have is just a plain number 2 pencil, I can just vary with how hard I press into the page. So with your extension lines for your dimensions, you always want to make sure you leave a little break between the building itself and the extension line that you're placing. And so I just left a little gap and drew kind of a lighter line out. And I already have this extension to borrow from my guideline, so I'll just bring that out. Now, I'm going to erase this little thing up here that says north, because it'll be in the way of my dimensions. Now remember, I had said you want to dimension for your openings to the center of them. So that's where that guideline that I use to help find the center comes in handy. And then I can take the rest of the guides, like the guides for the edges, and even then I got a little too close there. And I can erase those. What I am going to keep is this guideline right here that goes through the window and the door. And so for placing my dimensions here, what's really going to help me out is rather than having to place a dimension on this side for the center of this window and this door, is I can use a center line to help show the symmetry that these are on the same center. And so rather than having to place a dimension over here saying that, hey, this window is also 4 feet from that south wall, I can place that dimension just once. And see, this is why I always recommend you do your guides in like an H pencil or very lightly, because they can be kind of a pain to erase, particularly on tracing paper. So for my dimensions, I want to put the smallest dimensions closest to the building itself. So I want the dimension that says how far this is closer, and then I can have a little bit further out the dimension that tells me how wide the building is altogether. Now for your extension lines, you always want them to travel a little bit further past the dimension line itself. So you have what I call a little tail sticking out. And I erased that one's little tail, but I'll just go add it in. I'll add it back. And then I'll take this guide here and I'm going to change it into a center line. So that's a long, short, long, short, long, short, long. And so that line then symbolizes that these are in line with each other, so I don't have to put this dimension here. I'll add in, and I'll try to move this so that light isn't directly reflecting on that pencil mark. Maybe I can't move it, it's okay. I'll add in my architectural tick marks that just kind of help symbolize that's where the line ends. And then I would place the dimension itself above that line. And even if it's 0 feet, you still want, or 0 inches, you still want to put that 0 inches there. You don't just want to put 5 foot. And I'll say that it's 10 foot, 0 inches, again, 10 foot, 0 inches, and this one is 4 foot. 0 inches. And so we have that reflection thing up on that window is bugging the heck out of me. I mean, hopefully not you. There we have our floor plan of our little tiny shack. Okay. Now, for the next style of drawing is our elevations. So our elevations show the height of the object. And one thing to always consider is that there is different types of elevations, but when builders and architects are referring to a building elevations, they are talking about exterior elevations. So a set of working drawings typically is going to include each of the 4 sides of the building. If the building is very complex, there may be more than 4 elevations. And if the building is really simple, then there may be only just two elevations. There may be one of the front and then of just one of the sides. So it really depends kind of on the structure itself. Today we'll just practice doing just one, and then in your big drawing assignment that will start next week, you're going to only have to draw two elevations. So it's important to determine the relationship of one drawing to another one, which we refer to as orienting the drawing. So for example, if you know which elevation is the front of the building, you must be able to picture how it relates to the front of your floor plan, as well as then how the other elevations kind of relate to the object itself. So we kind of can think of this back to orthographics if we're thinking about our three main views. Your elevations, they are your front and your side view, but instead of just being able to do it in three views like a lot of objects can for manufacturing, a lot of elevations we do typically then in showing all of the sides. Elevations are also sometimes named according to different compass directions. And so when the elevations are named according to compass directions, they can be oriented to the floor plan, the foundation plan, and the site plan based on the north arrow in those plan views. So we can refer back to last week's lecture about the north arrow and how all plan views, all views from above, show which way is north. And then based on which way is north in your plan view, you can then orient your elevations. However, labeling elevations according to compass direction isn't always possible. When drawings are being prepared to be sold like through a website, just kind of as here's a general set of plans, or when they're maybe being used on several sites, so if it's just for a large development where that same building is going to just be made over and over again, a compass direction cannot be included. And in that case, elevations are named according to their position as you face the front of the building. And so in almost all sets of plans, the front of the building is usually located at the bottom of the sheet. It's not in all sets of plans, and so in some of our little demos, I tend to bring out the sets of plans for the high school. The high school's front of the building is actually on the side, but it is kind of more, the set of plan is oriented to how the building appears when you're kind of entering through that driveway. But oftentimes that front is going to be at the bottom. So for the different pieces of information in elevations, there usually isn't a lot of info, and while they don't include details and lots of dimensions and notes, I'm not saying there aren't any, but it's not a lot compared to like the floor plans. Elevations do show finishes on the appearance of the building better than other views. So in our floor plan, we can't really see what the exterior of the building looks like. We don't see a lot of the details about the windows. In the elevation, we can see that stuff a little bit better. And so they are a great aid in understanding the rest of the drawing set. The elevation is going to show most of the building, how it actually appears with solid lines. And in some elevations, we'll see the foundation and footing as hidden lines. The surface of the ground, or what we refer to as the grade line, is shown with a very heavy solid line, and it may include a note about the elevation above sea level or other reference point. So when we're looking at an elevation and we're looking at in what we call the spot elevations, or just kind of the various heights of it, which this drawing doesn't include, but I'll show when we do our demo, we will often consider the top of our floor, so right here, This often we consider as a height of 0, 0, and then we just use positive numbers for the different features above it. So like the sill of the window, the height of the window, the height of the wall. And then any information below it will typically put negative. So like finished grade here would be a -6 inches, and then this would be -4 feet, because it would be 3, 4 plus 6, and so on and so on. Rather than try to use like height above sea level to describe the different elevations here, we usually just use our floor as our sea level or as our 0, and then work our way from there. So other pieces of information that you'll find in elevations are the thickness of the footing, the height of the foundation walls, the height of the top of the finished floor to the ceiling, or what we call the top of plate, the finished floor to the window sills or the window headers, any roof overhang at the eaves, and whatever the pitch of the roof may be, which we describe as a rise over run. So how many inches does it go up to how many inches does we go over? When I'm creating drawings, I almost always draw the elevation with a rise over run of feet rather than inches, just because if I'm laying out that triangle, if I go 4 feet up and 12 feet over, the ratio equivalent is the same as going 4 inches up, 12 inches over. And it's just that way I have to draw out less lines. So we'll do another practice now, in which I'm going to create the north elevation of the floor plan we just did. The elevation is going to have a ceiling height of 10 feet from the top of the floor. Our floor is going to be 6 inches in thickness. The sill, or the bottom of our window, is going to be 2 feet above the top of the floor. The window header will be 7 feet above the top of the floor. We're going to use a 1 foot thick gable style roof that's sloping in the east and west directions with a pitch of 3/12. There is going to be no overhang in our roof, which is, not ideal, not how I would recommend designing or constructing it, but it's going to make drawing it a lot easier, and so we're not going to put an overhang. And we're going to use the same scale of a 1/2 inch equals a foot. So it's very common when you are creating sets of plans, whatever scale you use for the floor plan will be the same scale you use for the elevations. It just helps show kind of the story of how those views connect to each other to describe the whole building a bit better. And so, will I be able to fit this on the same sheet? Let me think about it. So if I've got my also for this elevation too, we are going to just ignore the, why can't I think of words right now? We're going to ignore the footing, the foundation and the footing. We'll go over that tomorrow when we look at section, or Wednesday when we look at section views. But for this, we should be okay. And okay, I think I can fit them both on this one sheet at this scale. Now, another important concept to think about is when you are putting 2 sets or 2 drawings on one sheet of paper, you want to try to align the views so that they match up with each other. So for example, if this was a 2-story house and I was drawing like the 2nd story underneath it on the same sheet, is I would want to, just like with an orthographic, I would want to have it aligned directly under here or directly above that first view. Because the elevation is a different view compared to this one, I don't necessarily have to have everything aligned. So I don't necessarily have to have everything lined up with each other. And in fact, I'm not going to put them on this same sheet, just because if I line that 10 foot by 10 foot up here, then I won't have enough room for my roof up at the top. And in fact, I may not even have enough room if I do it all from here. But by golly, I'm going to try. So I'm going to zoom this thing out a little bit by using my technical prowess of just moving it. And I'll retape my drawing. I'm going to try to move it over a little bit. Now, another good thing to bring up here too is, since I'm using the same sheet of paper, when I do retape this drawing, I'm taping it based off of a line that already exists on the sheet rather than just the edge of the page. And that's just because even though my elevation and my floor plan are two separate views on here, I still want to kind of show how the two of them interact with like that at least my lines are parallel and perpendicular, and it's not just my elevation like skewed over here. So if you are ever retaping a page down, you always want to go based on lines that already exist. Oops, I'm taping it to my T-square. Okay. So, for my elevation, we're going to make an elevation of the north side, which is that side of our house. And I'm going to do it over here. So, first thing is I'm going to establish the overall width of that north side. So if I was looking at the north side of my building, I've got an overall width of 10 feet. So I'm just going to pick somewhere to start, and I'll start my ground line a little bit further down here. That way I'll have enough room for my roof pitch. And I'm going to do this at a scale of 1/2 inch equals a foot. So I'll take my starting point, and I'm just going to measure 10 feet over and make a mark at 0, 10 feet up. Because I'm just using that amorphous 6-inch wall thickness, I don't need to take into consideration that 10 feet is from stud to stud. We're just kind of going to pretend that doesn't exist just for this demo. Because yes, then my siding would be included in on that 10 feet, and so my elevation wouldn't be exactly 10 to 10. But we're just going to ignore that little bit for now. And so I have this right here is my grade line. So this right here is the ground that my whole building is sitting on. I show it with a really heavy, thick line. I have a 6-inch thick floor. So from that grade line, I'm going to measure up 6 inches. And I'm just going to draw kind of a light guide. And then I have a 10-foot ceiling height from the top of the floor. So not from my ground line, but from the top of the floor, 10 feet up is my ceiling height. And ooh, I don't even know if my roof will, hopefully my roof should fit. So I'm just going to extend those guides up a little bit more since I didn't extend them up high enough to begin with. And so that then is my ceiling height. So I have got my 10-foot height, my 6-inch thick floor, and my ground line. And I have my 10-foot thickness of my north wall. I've got my window on my north wall that is centered on there. So again, I'm just going to measure across one of these lines 5 feet in. and that's going to be for the center of my window. And then I'm going to measure 1.5 feet out on either side. One thing I'll show in next week's full set of plans demo too is I'll show how I'll often borrow measurements from like the floor plan. So I'll just kind of, if I'm doing it on a new sheet, I can just kind of borrow things over there. But since it's only 2 measurements, I think I can handle it. And I have a window sill height of 2 feet above the top of the floor. So from that top of floor line, I'm going to measure up 2, and then I have a header height of 7. Typically it would be probably around 6'8", but I just wanted to use nice even whole numbers, and so that's why I made it 7. And so this right here is just the overall general rough opening of my window. And so the rough opening does not include things like your window trim. So once you measure out for your rough opening, then you would go extend outward for things like the trim. And erasers. It works really good on vellum. It does not work well on this tracing paper. So I've got my rough opening for my window. Why is it shaking so much? And I've got a 12-inch thick gable-styled roof that slopes east to west. So I'm going to have a sloped roof here, and it has a pitch of 3/12. So what that means is for every 3 feet I go up, I go 12 feet over. So I'm just going to lay out an initial guideline, and I lost my 1/2 inch one. Here we go. And I'm going to just measure from 0 to 3, line across, and then I'll measure to 12. And so that means the slope is like that, which, oh yeah, I've got a very low slope. I would definitely make it if I put it up here. And so then I'll do the same thing on the other side. Now I could have done this with inches, so I could have gone up 3/12, up 3/12, up 3/12, and I'd get the same end result. But for me to do it with feet, it's just a little bit easier. And so I'm just going to extend a guide up there, and I already know that that's 3 feet. And I'll bring this guide over a little bit so I can measure to where 12 is. And I'm just lining up my endpoints to connect. And so there's my roof. Measure up 1 foot since it's 12 inches thick. Measure up 1 foot. And then we do the same little dance again. And what I'll do is I'll erase these ones. Just because, let me get this table right off of that edge. So that way when I erase on the table, it doesn't shake the camera so violently. Whoops, I erased too much. I erased my 1 foot. Yep, 1 foot. 1 foot, and then from there I'll draw a guideline straight up, measure that out to be 3, guideline over, or there's another way I could do it too. We've got our 3. So instead of, so let me just measure my 12 feet over. And then 12 feet from this side. So rather than measuring out my pitch a second time, which it's not like it's the end of the world, which it doesn't even look like nope, because I didn't. I didn't have it. Perfect. I could have measured from here. I could have measured directly up 1 and then just connected it. But it's okay. I don't gotta measure twice is just fine. I'm even smudging a bunch with my hand like I was saying I didn't want to. Probably because it's 2 o'clock and I haven't eaten yet. Okay, so I've got my elevation done, or in my overall kind of my building. I've got my roof, pitch in there. And so often we'll go around the very outside of the building with a little bit of a thicker line, and then some of the details on the inside of the building with a thinner or thin-ish line. I know that's very technical, a thin-ish line. For your top of floor, because it's sitting behind the building itself, we actually show that with a hidden line or an evenly dashed line. And so that's again where a tool like an eraser shield can come in handy. So with my erasing shield, what I can do is just take that little dotted part and I could put it over it, my line, and it'll turn it into a nice evenly dashed line for me automatically. If you don't have an eraser shield, you can just go in with the eraser and just kind of erase in short little bursts. What you want to make sure you're doing is that you're leaving a little bit of line touching on both sides of the building, so you don't leave like a little gap between the building and the line itself. Same thing then for your casement window. And so the casement window in an elevation shows which way the window is swinging. So a casement is the kind that like opens up like that. I didn't specify which way it swings, so we're just going to say it swings on this side. Why do I have the wrong pencil? And since our building is 5 feet, I'm going to measure from the 6, or from our window is 5 feet, I'm going to measure from the 6 up to the 2, so that'll be the middle of the window. And I'll just draw guides. And I'll erase them into hidden lines. So again, if you don't have an eraser shield, just kind of go in with your pencil and just knock them out, just in little short pencil bursts. Now to add in my trim, I'm just going to go like 3 inches around each side. It doesn't say what the trim is, but I'm just going to make it like kind of a typical one. And is my big head in the way? Sometimes I don't realize my big head is just in front of the camera. And then the last detail I would add is the exterior siding. So a lot of times when we're putting hatching for siding on the outside, we don't necessarily have to add in it all the way across the entire building. We definitely could, but sometimes it's just helpful to just put like a little patch in one corner and a little patch in the other, and we can then infer what the rest of the siding is. So we have 6-inch vertical boards. So I'm just going to measure across 6 inches. I'm just going to make kind of some little marks. And then I'll do the same thing up here. So rather than put my hatch all the way across the sheet, I'm just going to kind of do it in 2 little areas. Run out of pencil. And hatch is usually done very, very lightly on the page. So I'm just going to lightly draw some vertical siding. And I don't necessarily have them all terminating at the same spot too, so to kind of show that these lines are fading or breaking almost. But I'll make these ones a little longer. And then what I would do is I would have a little leader that says, I'll just freehand the leader. And boop. I would say 6-inch vertical board. Now, the last thing we would have in our elevation view would be what we call spot elevations. And so at all of the significant heights, so I'd have a spot elevation here. I'd have one for the top of my window, for the bottom of my window. And notice how I'm lining it up with the rough opening, not with that siding I added. The top of floor. And then what I'm going to do is line them all up with each other, just to clean the drawing up a little bit. And this line more towards the right I put because that's where I'm going to just start my text. So I kind of just want a little reference that all of my texts start in the same space. And so this is going to be the top of ceiling. This is the top of header. The bottom of the sill, and the top of the floor. I'll just bring those lines out a little bit more. Additionally, with just the name of what each piece is, you'd want what that height is. So this would be top of floor, and its elevation is 0 feet, 0 inches. The bottom of the sill, which is at 2 feet, 0 inches. Our top of our header was at 7 feet, 0 inches. And our ceiling height was 10 feet, 0 inches. And then, last step, is you'd have your little circle, which I'm going to use this smaller one actually. Whoop. And so this little symbol just helps show that this is what we refer to as a spot elevation. And I don't have them perfectly centered, and that's okay. That's okay, because this is just a quick practice that maybe I'm putting a little bit too much effort in. And now I'm just getting hungry. So we'll all, after this, we'll all stop and take a nice little lunch break. And I have my elevation of my little shack complete. Okay. Last thing I just want to briefly speak about, and we're not going to do any practicing with, is an interior elevation. So if you see this symbol in a set of plans, this is referring to an interior elevation, and it's saying that there are 4 different views looking at the 4 different walls in this room. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And if I go to sheet A201, I'll find the interior views of each of those walls. And so interior elevations, and these would be those walls. So for interior ones, they're showing kind of details of maybe different outlets or switches, any material finishes, things that kind of are just of general importance for the construction. Typically we will show all 4 of them, but if maybe there is only one particular instance that's important, or one wall that has different features we need to note, then we can only have just 1 or 2. And so for instance, this little cutout here in this wall on wall 2, we can kind of see it here with this hidden line, but then the interior elevation really helps kind of understand a little bit more about it. And they're very common for things like bathrooms as well. So here then would be the symbol saying that there's view 1 for the bathrooms, and then this is view 1. So it's looking at that bathtub kind of cut open a little bit, the toilet, the cabinetry, and the cabinet placement, as well as the different mirrors that are above on the wall. View 2, so then looking at that bathtub kind of head on. View 3 would be looking at this side where we have these kind of storage cabinets, and so on and so on. So one fantastic thing, I know these are very complicated to look at first glance, but the fantastic thing with interior elevations, and especially with Revit, is that we can have them kind of done for us automatically. So once you place your elevation marker in there, the software can create the view for you, and then you just have to go in and add your different leader details about what each piece is. And so that is an hour-and-a-half brief introduction to floor plans and elevations. As I mentioned several times, next week for your first major hand drawing assignment, we'll start off with it of just doing a walkthrough step by step of laying out the set of plans for that assignment. But the more plans you look at and the more plans you practice with, the better you will get. As always, email if you have any questions. And I now am going to take a break and eat lunch. And I'll see you in the next recording.